I think I know almost everybody. So this is our lunchtime colloquium. There's a lunch. Very good account, but then the talks are also very interesting too. So and so welcome. That is my sort of great pleasure to have Varshney, who we've known each other for a number of years. I don't even know how many. Let's not count them. But I think I was a postdoc, and you were a student, I think, at MIT, where he was doing very interesting thesis work on information theory and various interesting problems. And through the years, we kind of every few years we saw each other and compared notes. Not often enough, but he's taken a very interesting path. Somebody really with expertise in computer science and information theory towards applications. A lot of them urban applications. We're working with IBM Smart Cities. We just spent some time with Salesforce, right? Yep. And really also getting into more of artificial intelligence problems. But in some sense, what I always love about Lavs' work is that he's very rigorous, as sort of an information theorist and computer scientist, and knows all about algorithms and how they may be used. But he also always is looking for sort of places, applications that really touch how societies work, how cities work. So I think this talk today will be very much in that spirit. He is an associate professor now at Urbana-Champaign, which is sort of one of the great places for computer science, as you know. But he comes to Chicago, I hear, quite a bit for a variety of reasons. He knows a lot of people, like some of you here. Well, I know we hope they'll spend time with us, but he also spends time with the Discovery Partners Institute, which is the source room at universities, of which University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign is a big part. And also, you have a very interesting project with our people about music.
Yeah, I'll just briefly touch on that. But yeah, thanks so much, Luis, for the invitation and
take it away.
The introduction.
I was going to say something about what you're doing today, which is kind of interesting, because we look at cities often as networks, right, where really space mediates all kinds of relationships, and these are essential for people to have a decent life. And he has an interesting way, basically, Lav has an interesting way of looking at this from an algorithmic computer science lens and finding somewhat optimal ways and ways that will find you of thinking about increasing equity in these networks.
Yep. Great,
so take it away. Thank you.
Yep, thank you so much, Luis. And in fact, as I was preparing the talk, I thought I would actually talk about this topic, but then also a few others. In particular, I think I'll focus more on kind of the formulations and the results, and a little bit less on the algorithm details. As Luis was mentioning, I got really interested in cities back in 2011 when I spent some time. I was a researcher at IBM and spent some time in Syracuse, which is also my hometown, working on the Smarter Cities Challenge project. And it was really nice to kind of be like sitting in City Hall and being embedded with the city staff and talking to the mayor and all these things. Just to kind of get a sense of how complicated cities are, but then also that there are potentially low-hanging fruit for interventions based on AI and so on. And of course, back in 2011, AI was the term that wasn't used very much. I think we used to call it data analytics back then. What we did back then was we developed predictive analytics to facilitate housing policy, basically, vacancy policy. So traditionally what had been done was if a house becomes abandoned, then there's tax liens and eventually the city might take over. And then it's already kind of in a bad state and it has downstream impacts on the rest of the neighborhoods as well, as it leads to drug crime and things like that. But if you could predict which houses might go vacant in advance, you could take proactive actions and actually do that. And so, when we were there, we built this technology to actually predict in advance which houses are most likely to become vacant, and also which houses that are currently vacant are most easy to flip around to occupancy. And this allowed the city to actually take actions. So They developed what's called the Greater Syracuse Land Bank, and the mayor and her team actually was able to use this mechanism to take advantage of our predictive analytics and then take actions. And so then once houses are in the land bank, it's easier for other people to claim them, to buy them and live there. And these basic ideas were actually also propagated through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so this was kind of one of the first kind of predictive approaches to housing policy. So this was exciting and really got me thinking about cities at the time. And I also ended up visiting Luis in Santa Fe around a little bit after that. And so then he inspired me to also think about kind of the science of cities a little bit. For example, we looked at the pace of life in cities and the emergence of town tweeters. So looking at kind of Twitter rates in different cities in the US. And contrary to all the work that Luis had done on superlinear scaling, we actually saw sublinear scaling of tweets, so population. But then we dug in and we saw that there was kind of this ecological fallacy. And so if you look at individuals with greater population density, there was greater tweeting. And so it was kind of suggested that there was an emergence of this core of users that what we call town tweeters that were kind of serving as a broadcast infrastructure for Twitter and cities. And so this was kind of looking at, this was the first thing I was mentioning is kind of really just kind of building AI to help the city with policy. So it's kind of trying to look at cities in kind of a more infrastructure sense.
So can I just ask a clarifying question about those last 2 points? So why would a greater density of tweeters in large cities then be assisted with sublinear scaling rather than
so there's so the total volume of tweets increases sublinearly. But there's if you look at just restrict yourself to a core of users, there's some of them that are tweeting much more than.
Okay. So that would, yeah. If you took that as the tweet exposure.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So, and so I visited Luis, and we were also talking about kind of some historical cities like Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley civilization, which was built around 2600 BC, and perhaps one of the world's earliest major urban settlements. And if you look at properties of Mohenjo-Daro, if you look at the house size distribution based on some statistical analysis from 1978, the Gini coefficient is 0.24. And if you exclude these two, which are thought to actually to be public buildings rather than personal dwellings, it goes down to 0.14. And so, so it seems like it's a fairly equitable distribution of house sizes, a better Gini coefficient than most modern cities. Also, they had the first indoor plumbing in history. Wastewater was carried out of houses via pipes, and then those were drained out of town. And they also used buildings made out of sun-dried brick, which have nearly zero carbon requirements, very low embodied energy. And so Mohenjo-Daro is very interesting to me because it has these kind of properties that we think of as maybe a good thing for cities. That it was equitable in some sense, sanitary, and also sustainable. And this kind of thinking, obviously this is kind of a post-talk explanation, but in constructing the talk, but some of these properties are some things I've been thinking about now over the years, and I'll try to get into how we've been developing some AI technologies to help with equitability, equity, sanitation, and sustainability for cities. And I'll focus on some examples we've worked on, especially in the Chicago area. Okay, so the first is the problem that the talk title is focused on, graph augmentation for equitable access. And this is joint work with my former colleagues at Salesforce Research, Sachin Ramchandran, Ivan Berger, who did his PhD at UI Chicago. So he's actually well versed in Chicago as well. shown. So if you look at infrastructure networks in Chicago in particular, like bus lines, they may not provide equitable access to resources. So if you look at the housing patterns in Chicago, it's very highly segregated by race and ethnicity. So for example, Black communities are down here in the South Side, Hispanic, and so on. And then if you look at the transit network, this is from the Chicago Transit Authority bus routes. This is the red network here. And then we've also placed high quality schools in the Chicago public schools as the yellow things. And you can see that not every neighborhood has a good school. And in fact, certain neighborhoods like around here don't have high quality schools near them or over here. So different places, kind of there's a disparate impact of, or disparate ability of different subpopulations to access high quality schools from a transportation perspective. And so one might ask, is it possible to modify the bus routes in such a way that you can improve this kind of equitable access? And one would imagine that modifying bus routes is easier than building new schools. And so perhaps this is something that's actually implementable in short periods of time. And you can do the same kind of analysis for things like grocery stores and voting booths and COVID vaccination sites and so on. There's kind of this disparate relationship between location and so there's disparate access to resources by different subpopulations. And in fact, it's prevalent. I'm just showing that Chicago example, but this is pretty prevalent in various cities. And so urban infrastructure might enable certain racial groups to more easily access resources. And this is true not just for physical infrastructure, but also for informational infrastructure. If you look at social networks within universities or organizations, they may enable certain groups to access people with valuable information. There's a lot of homophily in social networks, and so being in group to the resource nodes actually helps. And in fact, this is a long-standing problem in economics, planning, and public policy. And since individual level fairness is often impossible for these spatial structure problems, the focus has been on group level fairness. And several metrics have been proposed and optimized. Marsh and Schilling in 1994 have a really good discussion of this. And there's been very recent work on simultaneous optimization of several notions of here we take up the same challenge, but here we are looking at network structured problems rather than spatially structured ones. So we don't think of the city as a full kind of real valued or continuous field where you can move things around, but a discrete thing, a network structured thing where you can just add edges between those. And we'll use demographic parity as the notion of fairness. And it's related to facility location problems that are also quite prevalent in literature. In fact, one can actually show a kind of a duality between editing edges and editing the location. And so, in fact, it turns out mathematically that this problem formulation I'll show you is a generalization of facility location. So what we're going to consider is editing the edges of graphs under budget constraints to improve equity and equitable access. And we'll specifically have a diffusion model of mobility. So we're not going to be looking at shortest paths. We're going to look at kind of general flows, kind of diffusion through the network. We felt that this was a little bit more general than kind of explicit shortest paths. And again, it applies to transportation networks, social networks, and so on.
So these are coverage paths?
So we'll have a distribution for each subgroup where they're located, and then they'll diffuse at an average level as well. And again, this is quite related to some recent work in the AI fairness literature et al. And then also this group Fish. Okay, so the way we want to think about this, we'll call this the graph augmentation for equitable access problem. So suppose we have purple and red populations that are distributed in different ways spatially. And the individuals, we traverse the edges of their respective colors. So this purple might traverse these. And then, as you can notice here, in the original graph, the red group is disadvantaged in accessing the resource node number 2, because there's a longer path. And so, if we think of the possibility of adding edges, if we added in, say, from 4 to 2, that would improve and equalize the access for 4 access. And sorry, it would be hard to see, but there's a gray edge here that's potentially editable. That's potentially something you can allow. We didn't allow in this constrained version the edge report. Okay, so as you solve this problem like this, you would want to add this edge report to, and we would do this under a budget constraint. That there's only so many edges you can. It's the high-level formulation here. Unfortunately, it turns out that this Gaia problem is a generalization of facility location, and therefore it's NP-hard. And further, it's actually not approximable either, relatively approximable within a factor of 1. And so, so there you won't be able to get any performance guarantees on any heuristic algorithms that you can develop. But what we do is we actually develop a mechanism designed for this problem using a Markov reward process formulation. So basically a reinforcement learning kind of formulation. And we can evaluate how it performs, but we won't be able to get performance guarantees. And just to give a little bit of the formalism, I won't get into this in too much detail, but we're given a graph, a set of disparate groups, and a set of resource nodes. And then we define system dynamics in terms of these labeled particles by group membership, and they're governed by this diffusion process through the graph. And their starting points are governed by a segregated starting. And then we define value functions for the particles as the average cumulative discounted cost to reach the lower nodes as part of this diffusion. And then the value function for groups is the averages for the particles. And then further, we relax the possibility that they have these as continuous functions rather than discrete functions. So that allows us to use gradient descent and other modern optimization methods when we're populating these.
Yes, so how does the reward is a function of its relative surprise information theoretically to you, or just you have a static value?
Yeah, it's based on the distance, essentially, like how far you have to diffuse to get there.
Okay, and just so why then? So let's just imagine that these aren't. I mean, they could be discriminatory. You know, it could be the bridges. The limited bus transport somewhere.
Right.
But let's also respond to the fact that many of these things are marketable. You're going to develop a transport where there's a lot of people taking the transport. And so do you have any evidence to suggest that the people would take transport that's evolved in this way rather than the transport that they actually take?
No, we didn't investigate that. So that's a good question. Yeah. So what we did was then we get this formulation, and we'll do the mathematical thing. It's something we're actually interested in doing, is trying to see whether one actually does make changes of this type, does it actually influence behavior. That's something we're super interested in trying to explore.
Because this is pretty expensive. It's not as expensive as changing the location of the asset, but it's still pretty expensive.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a more easy example to test this hypothesis in social networks. All it requires is a burrito to do those changes. So I'll go into that in a minute. So So, and then one can perform the Markov random process optimization to balance the value functions for that parity objective under the budget constraint. Again, I decided not to go into the mathematical details too much, but if you're interested, they're all in the paper, how we implement this. And this is part, as Luis was mentioning, I was on leave at Salesforce Research in 2019 to 2020 academic year. And we were actually doing a lot of reinforcement learning for good type problems. So this was kind of at a medium scale of city infrastructure. We also did quite a bit of work at a macro scale. We developed, I was kind of tangentially involved, but we developed some ways of doing large scale agent-based simulations to develop tax policy that optimizes for both productivity and equity. And we're able to demonstrate that this outperforms, of course, the US federal tax code, not surprising, but also, so SIAS at Harvard has a so-called optimal tax policy for balancing these, but in a dynamical setting where the agents are acting as reinforcement learning agents, in a dynamic setting, this technique actually outperforms even SIAS's formula. It reduces back to SIAS's formula in the static. Okay, so it was kind of a nice demonstration that large-scale computation can actually be used for mechanism design for taxation policy. And we also did quite a bit of work with partner organizations like CityLink Center in Baltimore. I'm sorry, in Cincinnati. And what they do is they advise people on how to get out of poverty. So if I'm in poverty, should I take a class, or should I try to find a new job, or should I seek mental health treatment, or should I try to find better childcare? Then what's the next thing, and then what's the next thing? And so one can treat that as a sequential decision-making problem. And kind of the premise is to find optimal paths out of poverty given what people's goals and starting points. And so we work quite closely with CityLink Center to demonstrate this. Okay, so coming back now to the Chicago bus lines and schools. So this has 2,111 nodes and about 8,000 edges. And resource nodes are defined to be schools at a rating of over 90th percentile. The budget for segmentation is 100 edges. And so if we look at the initial distance from the nodes to the school, considerably with our process formation against kind of 90 baselines, and then also the variance between groups decreases. Right, so we're achieving both objectives of reducing total distance to schools, as well as the difference between groups.
And is that initial average distance based on the actual routes of school or buses, or from the students would be as experienced by the students? Is this sort of projected based on?
This is based on those diffusion dynamics. Okay. So assuming those. Okay, so just adding a few, just 100 edges can make a huge difference. Just a small change in bus systems that can make a very large difference if you choose them in the right way. And now going to the social network version of this. So if you look at the social network in universities, Facebook had released a data set in the initial days of Facebook. It's called the Facebook 100 data set. It's the social network for 100 universities. And the nodes are labeled by gender, by major, by residence type. And so here we're looking at gender. And here we ask, again, the same model, but we're looking for, we define influence nodes as seniors in specific majors. And we ask what are the same kinds of distances. And again, we can demonstrate that the algorithmic approach we propose can reduce the distance, the average distances quite considerably, and also can reduce the disparity in certain colleges. At Caltech and was already kind of even to begin with, but at Reed College or at Michigan State, we're able to reduce the disparity between the groups as well. Yeah.
This is just a clarification, but like, is the idea here that, so it's connectivity to seniors, so there's some kind of benefit by being close to the student leaders?
Yeah, that's the premise of the system, yeah. So I forget which majors we had chosen, but we had kind of picked them to be something that seemed reasonable as knowing people who do that as well. So, so this was kind of the result. And again, the way to edit social network graphs is you give people burritos and have them have lunch together. That's how you add these college social networks. So that this would be a much easier experimental business, as James was. Okay, so we proposed this Gaia formulation of editing graph edges to achieve equitable diffusion dynamic space utility across disparate groups, and evaluations showed the efficacy of the algorithm. And we measured a particular equal opportunity fairness metric, but one can definitely think about other formulations. And this is notably distinct from community fairness, no matter how abstractive we are. Okay, so let me just pause there for a second. Any questions or comments on this kind of line of investigation? Okay.
So this is a clarification. Are we going to have a chance to ask questions on this again, or are you moving into a totally separate project?
Yeah, I'm going to move into a totally separate project.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So it's really a question. So now we are trying to model based on specific locations. You were mentioning schools or working booths and so on. But one of the aspects that you would like is also where they work. And so I know that in some cases, people are modeling, for instance, distance to work, and certain communities are systematically forced to do a longer commute.
Yeah.
And so would it be possible to extend the model not to specific locations, but by accounting for those distance and rearranging, I don't know, if that be possible?
Yeah, I think so. So instead of discrete resource nodes, you would have kind of a more distributional notion of it. Yeah, I think that would definitely be possible. And in fact, the diffusion dynamics that we assert is more amenable to that than the shortest path to correlations.
I was wondering whether you brought this the results of your model to actual policymakers in Chicago, and what is their reaction?
Yeah, not yet. So if you guys have connections, yeah, happy to get help on that. Yeah, Chris.
I had two thoughts, kind of especially with regard to thinking about the Chicago schools. Well, I guess three thoughts. And one was we had a fascinating series of seminars maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you'll care about the call, but it was all about schools and like social mobility with different students. And one of the really interesting takeaways that I had no idea going into this, I learned from that, was like based on growth in test scores as a measure of school quality, there was very little variation across schools in terms of quality per se, and especially without a correlation to neighborhood income levels, which was for me very surprising because I assumption. But I just wonder, like, in terms of engaging with, like, on that project, also engaging with education literature, if I understand exactly where we're going in terms of looking at these, but like in terms of the test scores, there would maybe be a very different implication about where students should have buses to be able to access. But I mean, so I had other kind of background questions about like a lot of the rest of the environment is kind of presumed to be static in these models, right? So I mean, I'm sure this is $1 million questions, like, okay, what happens when like housing prices start to evolve? What happens when school quality is endogenous to the bus routes and so forth? And then the last thing that I had in mind was forgetting. Oh yeah, it goes back to one of James' questions about what types of transport people are actually using. And I was thinking about like, well, could you start to model the preferences or something of the transportation or education consumers or something like that? And some of that data would be like available for census, for example, commute loads, so forth, and just to get some kind of weighting in there.
Yeah, I think that's these are all very good suggestions for further investigation. Thanks. So the next problem I wanted to talk about was related to wastewater treatment. And this is my work with folks from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, and Syracuse, which is a startup I'm involved in, and the University of Illinois Chicago. This is the Thornton Reservoir. It's quite large. It's about the size of 14 soldier fields. This is showing it at about 10% full. And it's located here in this part of Chicago over here. It provides flood protection by reducing combined overflow and serves about 500,000 people in 14 communities in this southern Chicago region. I mean, as I was saying, it's very large. And one of the downsides of this this reservoir is that sometimes it produces bad odors, and people in the surrounding neighborhoods find it quite objectionable. And so,
Is that it combines like sewer overflow, or is it just runoff?
so Chicago has combined rain and sewer systems. So when there's rain events, then the combined overflow goes into reservoirs.
I see.
And so, yeah, as you may know, historically, the Army Corps of Engineers actually reversed the flow of the Chicago River about 120 years ago, I think. And because of that, Chicago has some of the largest of these water and wastewater treatment systems in the world. So this is one of the reservoirs, but there's actually several throughout Chicagoland. And yeah, I mean, there's some of the largest engineering projects in history, actually, the Chicago water and wastewater system. So this is one particular reservoir, but I mean, there's several others as well that have similar problems. And as I was mentioning, when this went online in 2015, WRD got a lot of odor complaints from the neighborhoods, right? Smell, this is just a word problem for complaints. Smells, sewage, strong, odor, etc. And this is really problematic. I mean, it's not just a perceptual thing. I mean, it degrades people's quality of life considerably when it smells your reservoir. Yeah, so, and it also.
So forgive me, we live here. Where is this thing?
Oh, it's right here.
Isn't that little red box?
It's the green. It's the green one right here.
Ah.
Oh, no, sorry, this one. This is the green. Yeah, the Thornton Reservoir. So it's kind of the southern. It's around. It's I think south of
Midway,
No.
No, it's further south.
Oh,
I think
down
before
there,
the city.
south.
Yeah, the city is here.
Back to the yard.
It's like near Railroad Marsh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So. Yeah, so I mean, this is very complex as well. There's a lot of factors that impact odor, both the generation of odor, the dispersion of odor, and the human smell perception and complaint behavior. And it's difficult to predict odor complaints in advance or to determine the exact source of odor. And that's where we developed some AI algorithms to actually help. So what we wanted to do was 3-day advanced warning with at least 60% accuracy and less than 25% false positives. And also insight into the sources and factors that influence odor and help with odor remediation. So, so there's a lot of things that go into this: the weather, the operational factors of the reservoir, biochemistry, that leads to odor production. And then the weather also, wind speeds influence odor spreading, as well as and height of the reservoir and so on. And then there's odor control. So we have a lot of data types, hydrogen sulfide sensors, weather data, operations data. Those are kind of the predictive attributes, and then odor components. And one can use now the labeled historical data to train a model to make predictions in the future. And when one does that, one can actually achieve those objectives we were aiming for. More than 70% positives, less than 25% false positives, and characterize what were the most important attributes. And this is nice because then MWRD can actually take actions to mitigate these. Since they know 3 days in advance that there's going to be an odor event. I mean, one thing they could do was chemical treatment, but they decided not to do that because of cost. But they have this other way of using activated carbon filters at a particular part of the system. And so now they've actually done this, and so it's been in operation now for a couple of years, and it seems to have reduced odor complaints quite considerably. So it seems to have kind of improved life in that community a fair bit. So this was quite exciting, and it was also deployed. The same techniques have been deployed beyond the Thornton Reservoir. In fact, the MWRD is now considered one of the leaders in using machine learning and AI for wastewater treatment on the utilities. In fact, we were also in a competition with them in the wastewater industry, and we were kind of the second place winner in that competition for using AI for water and wastewater treatment problems in the industry. And this was a nice concrete example of doing this for a problem that we actually did.
So just to understand, what was the reward?
So we want to predict the odor complaints correctly.
So you just used empirical, you didn't use any surveys, just empirical odor complaints.
Yeah, empirical odor complaints. Yeah, exactly. One would have imagined that one could have used, say, hydrogen sulfide sensor data, but it turned out that that was less predictive. I mean, there's one factor that went into the predictions, but all the other things also played a role. So just sensing the production of odor is insufficient. You have to also look at the spreading and the humidity as well.
But this constrains your search space then too, because you can only work on data where there's been complaints, and how many complaints are there?
There's a lot of complaints.
Enough to build a reinforcement layer that fixes the problem. Okay, point taken.
Yeah, so that was kind of focusing on sanitation, which improves people's lives quite a bit in urban settings. If you're from a more rural setting like I am these days, I mean, you're used to more odor events, I think. So, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about was sustainable building materials. And this is joint work with some folks from IBM Research, as well as originally from MIT, but now both working with our colleagues in civil engineering. And so the basic question is, can we develop better building materials than traditional concrete? So about 8% of global emissions from humans are from the cement industry alone. And there was a nice editorial in Nature just last month. And so there's interest in reducing the environmental impacts of construction materials while still being sufficiently strong from a building perspective. And so if we can, for example, have the carbon requirements, I mean, that's a huge factor from a global perspective. And then that's exactly what we do, actually come up with formulations that require half as much carbon emissions to make as traditional formulations. So, so we had a small historical data set of concrete formulations, 1,000 instances, where we have 8 input variables that are the composition. Things like water, gravel, cement, fly ash, and then we have the compressive strength, how strong it is, and then environmental impact variables that are computed using life cycle analysis from the Sustainability Institute initiative. This is carbon, embedded carbon, embedded sulfur dioxide, other things like that. Okay, so what we did was we used a conditional variation autoencoder as a generative model, and we wanted conditioning variables to be able to influence the environmental impacts. And we also wanted extrapolative ability. We wanted to be able to do things that are different than just the traditional formulations. Yeah, we use kind of standard deep learning techniques. We also build property predictors, and one can look at the strength condition progression. So one can kind of one thing with concrete is it gets harder over time. So you can look at 7-day strength, 28-day strength. This is the desired strength. This is what we input as conditioning variables, and then this is what was predicted computation. And so eventually you can't actually get to certain strengths it doesn't work. And so there's kind of some limits to and so from a purely computational perspective, what we were able to demonstrate is that so these three blue points are existing formulations, and then the purple and orange points are new ideas which are generated by the algorithm. So a large ensemble, and the ones that are in orange are better on all three of these key sustainability metrics, and the convex model is shown as well. And so this is much better on all three.
So could you go through those three sustainability metrics?
Yeah, so this is acidification potential, this is sulfur dioxide. This is global warming potential, this is carbon dioxide. And then this is batching water consumption. So this is essentially a measure of how much water you use when you make so we're able to demonstrate ensembles that are much better than existing formulations. This is fully computationally. In fact, we achieved, for example, about 42% reduction for a typical carbon dioxide reduction. And this is kind of a weird metric. We were using the conditional average reduction. This was a very conservative metric. This is comparing the average of the orange against the blues. Okay? But you could have picked the best orange, and that would actually be much better. So, so often, yeah, you can get 40% reductions in carbon or 30%, depending on what you're. And so then we actually went forward with several mixes. This doesn't mean much to this audience, perhaps, but if you're a civil engineer, maybe you could look and see, but it's kind of unusual. And then there was a little bit of human adjustment. The data set that we had drawn on was in the 1980s. And it turns out that this component called superplasticizer has changed. And so my colleague in civil engineering, Nishant, actually, when he was going to make the cylinder for us to touch, he realized this and he kind of manually adjusted it. And so it was kind of an interesting example of data shift, just because the nature of the ingredient actually shifted. Right? And so now we have this kind of heuristic that we reduce the superplasticizer by 1/4 when we take the AI prefixes. And so then he actually went ahead and made the cylinders and crushed them. And this was the target compressive strength, the black. And so we achieved quite a bit of greater compressive strength than was targeted. So that was civil engineers like to be conservative, so being well above the requirements is a good thing. So, so we were able to demonstrate in the lab that we actually achieved this. And for those mixes that I was mentioning, these are the carbon emissions. So they're pretty much half. So these are the industry average for similar strength, and these are achieved by our algorithm, and the ones that are actually. And so you see that you can have huge improvements having the carbon. So that's really exciting. And if you're not a civil engineer, let me just plot out how our formulation is different. So this is showing, these are all except this one are existing formulations of similar strength. This is a isomap embedding, a low dimensional embedding of the 8-dimensional formulation. And you can see that our formulation uses much less cement than any of the other formulations. And in this space, it is actually kind of novel and distinct. So it is really pushing people to do things that they wouldn't have. And now there's a full deployment in DeKalb. A company is sponsoring our research to actually do full deployment of our mixes, and they're building a very large data center in DeKalb, Illinois. And we have test results demonstrating the efficacy even in full deployment, but I can't tell you those results yet. We're still getting emphasis on that. But suffice it to say that it works even in building full buildings.
Are there any like technical drawbacks to these new mixed recipes, like economic costs or anything like that? Reasons why people would opt for this?
Yeah, doesn't seem like it. The only thing that might eventually happen is it uses some industrial byproducts like fly ash and slag, which are starting to become less available. So I mean, that could be a possibility, but Nishant and I are working on a different project to source new ways of getting fly ash from municipal solid waste rather than coal plants.
So like, there's no like additives that are like hard to come by?
No,
or
yeah, that's the thing. This is using just standard supply chain, standard ingredients, just mixing them differently, and it improves things by a considerable amount. Okay, so
From a policy perspective, right? So this looks really positive, and I mean, on paper, and probably also buildings
Right.
may work well. But I wonder, what is the next step? I mean, how do you achieve maximum impact of this discovery?
yeah, so I think that's what we're trying to think through right now. Nishant, my colleague in civil engineering, is an expert in concrete. I mean, that's what he does. And so he's trying to explore kind of better ways of getting the word out and convincing people that this is worth trying. It's quite different than what people have done in traditionally, and so I mean, there's some minds to be changed. But I think demonstration projects like this one, the Facebook data center that we're helping build, I think that'll go a long ways to do that.
Kind of related question. So, okay, so let's just assume that people have been, concretes have been around for a long time, and pretty ancient industry. So to what degree do we see search in historical concretes, right, over the space of mixes? The reason I'm asking is, basically, is what's going on is you're just incorporating novel objectives that either as constraints or as fundamentally dual or multiple objectives. Is that what's going on here, or is it just the institutions themselves are so sticky that that even for their own performance metrics they're doing poorly, let alone for like a host of objectives that are alien to them?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think in the last few years there has been a desire to reduce carbon emissions for concrete. So it's not that the objective has been completely unknown, but I think there is a lot of inertia in how to explore things. Actually, the cement supplier that worked with us, I mean, those conversations with those folks were quite interesting in this respect. I mean, we were suggesting using much less cement than they're used to, using these other cementation materials, and it's just contrary to other things. So I think the AI did kind of push people into a different way of thinking than they would have otherwise.
Are there like any risks, like in terms of, this specific recipe when implemented, if the recipe is more sensitive to slight variations in like the components, could that like, because when a concrete pour happens, that you want to get 100% right.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, no. In honesty, I'm not as familiar with all the details of these things, but from what I understand, I don't believe there's any of those issues. Okay, so that's kind of largely what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to close with some broader visions of AI for good. For example, to pursue the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So one can try to think about public health. These are all projects I've done in the past, but I mean, one can think about obesity and other aspects of public health using AI. You can think about sustainable farming, developing culinary recipes that are both sustainable and healthy. One can think about human resource questions in workforce, questions like racial discrimination, child abuse, impact sourcing, which is a way of bringing jobs to places where there may not be, and so on. And so it seems like there's a lot of avenues for using AI for good, especially in urban contexts.
1:30 class coming there.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I'm close to wrapping up. And some of the projects we're working on right now are also in this direction. We're working with folks in the College of Agriculture on blockchain-based trust augmentation as a way to improve agronomic efficiencies in farming and places like Africa and Nepal. And the main consideration there is that the parcel sizes are very small. And so one can't use modern techniques like tractors because the turning radius of the tractor is bigger than the field itself and things like that. And so if you can virtually aggregate them, farm things all together, that can improve the productivity quite considerably. But the difficulty is people don't trust each other that things will happen as they wish. And so we've been working on using blockchain-based trust augmentation. My colleagues in crop sciences at Illinois are doing field experiments as well to try these things out. Another kind of related problem is I'm working with someone from the Indian Forest Service, and there's been a great push for tree planting programs. Everyone wants to kind of have ways to capture carbon, so you should plant trees. But what foresters realize is you can't plant trees everywhere. Certain soils and certain things are constraints on that. And so we've been drawing on some ideas from ecology, but then also AI algorithms to predict which kinds of trees can be planted where, and producing kind of these fundamental limits. If you're an information theorist like me, it's nice. You're actually drawing on ideas like carrying capacity and ecology to say, in fact, you can only have 30% coverage of trees here. You can't really achieve the objectives the government or the United Nations is trying to push for. And yeah, again, my colleague at the Indian Forest Service is doing some field trials with the AI recommender for what to plant there. And James and myself and others, Will Patterson, is depicted. We're working on some AI-based music co-creation to kind of enhance cultural wealth in urban communities, especially. So this is an AI platform that helps people remix components of sound into new compositions. So we're really excited about that, working with a lot of communities in Illinois, here in Chicago and St. Louis and Sheffield. And one last thing that I wanted to mention was kind of on the education side, developing AI-based speech technologies for low resource languages. So there's an organization called Early Spark that I advise. And so what we're working on is a way to measure student engagement in classrooms, to be able to assess whether teacher training to improve engagement actually works. And this is in rural Karnataka in India. And it's kind of it's an unusual dialect, actually, a little bit different than the standard I'm blanking on what language is spoken there, but it's a slightly different dialect. And so kind of developing speech technologies for this setting is fairly challenging, but we're able to make some progress there. So yeah, so a lot of kind of interesting problems in AI for group that seem to be emerging, whether in specifically urban settings or also in some of the rural settings that I was describing just now. So I think I'll stop there then.
Are there any questions, especially in the Zoom audience? So we'll just close it from here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Will.
What's your schedule?